Finland is preparing itself for war with Russia. Just like its neighbors Sweden and Norway, the Nordic countries are distributing pamphlets to all citizens with advice on what to do in case of a war. This obviously has to do with Russia because of its recent invasion into Ukraine and its proxy war with the NATO alliance. After Sweden and Finland joined NATO in 2023, Scandinavia became one of the most direct places of confrontation between NATO and Russia. Finland in particular has a lot of tensions with Russia because of their 830-mile or 1,340-kilometer border. The country basically has Russia at gunpoint, as it's very close to some of Russia's most important military bases and cities. But the reverse also holds true, as Russia is just a much bigger nation. It poses a significant threat to Finland's national security. Historically speaking, this has gone wrong multiple times, with drastic consequences for Finland, but also for Russia. That's why Finland is not looking to risk anything this time around and is already preparing for war. In this video, we'll go over how Finland is preparing for the worst-case scenario and how a potential war would play out. As you'll see, Russia has all the reason to second-guess invading the country. As the Finnish government stated in their pamphlets, they're well prepared for self-defense. Please hit the like button down below to support the channel. And without further ado, let's get into the topic. To understand why Finland is preparing for war and warning its citizens with pamphlets, we need to understand some important context. You see, Finland and Russia have had a shaky relationship for centuries, fighting multiple wars with each other. For more than 100 years, Finland was also a part of the Russian Empire, with mixed results. These memories from the past have not disappeared, and as we'll go into now, they teach a lot of lessons for the current day. Finland has fought Russia several times back when it was part of the Swedish Empire. Actually, Finland as a country didn't exist back then, as Sweden took it over in the 12th and 13th century and went on to hold it for 6 centuries. There was only a separate Finnish culture and language. The Swedish Empire fought their Russian rivals in the east dozens of times, going back to the 12th century. They fought the former Novgorod Republic, the following Grand Duchy of Moscow, the Tsardom of Russia, and finally also the Russian Empire. So you could say that the Russians and the Swedes were natural enemies. A big reason for this was that they both wanted to control the Baltic Sea because it was valuable for trade. The Russians also saw the Swedish Empire as a major threat because their territory is hard to defend and they have some key cities in the west. Sweden's imperial and expansionist behavior wasn't comforting them either. Apart from Finland, the Swedes conquered parts of Norway, northern Germany, the modern-day Baltics, and Karelia, which is now Russian. In the early 1700s, though, the Russians delivered a huge blow to the Swedish Empire as they defeated it in the Great Northern War, aided by some powerful allies. Russia gained Baltic territories and replaced Sweden as the great power in Northern Europe, but Finland was still part of Sweden. That would change in the 1740s when Sweden lost a new war and was forced to give away some eastern parts of Finland. There would be another war in the 1780s, but the big blow came with the Finnish War starting in 1808. It resulted in a massive victory for Russia, and Russia replaced Sweden as a great power. It captured the whole of Finland, which became part of the Russian Empire in 1809 as the Grand Duchy of Finland. At first, the Finns had a lot of autonomy within the empire, as they had their own legislative assembly. There was also room for their own national identity within the empire. The Russians saw Finland more as a strategic buffer zone and didn't want to interfere too much. But as the Russian Empire declined, so did the situation in Finland. A century later, the Russian Tsar Nicholas II pushed for Russification in Finland. He implemented Russian as the administrative language and the language taught in schools. Finland's political autonomy was cut, as the Russian imperial government was all of the sudden able to override any decision made by Finland's own government in 1899. Several governance tasks were shifted to the central government in St. Petersburg. The same year, the ruble was implemented as Finland's currency. Finland's military was abolished in 1901, and the Russians started to censor anti-Russian sentiments and exile Finnish nationalist politicians. Finland didn't like this, but it was a sign that the Russian authorities were scared. The Tsar was increasingly losing his control over his vast empire due to poor governance and military defeats. When he failed miserably in World War I, the situation exploded. The Russian Revolution took off in 1917, and the Bolsheviks eventually took hold after brutal fighting. Finland was not isolated from this. A year later, the country had a civil war between communist Red Finland and anti-communist White Finland. The Red Army was helped by Soviet Russia, and the White Army was directly supported by Germany. The German-supported forces won, but Germany lost the bigger conflict. World War I was still going on at the time, and the Central Powers lost against the Allies. For Finland, this meant that they escaped being a German proxy state, but they also avoided being a communist vassal of the Soviets. The Finns got full sovereignty for the first time in history and started a moderate democratic republic. Their goal was not to get too involved in international politics. This lasted for about 2 decades, but the security situation in Europe declined again. As Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union invaded Poland, World War II began, with major consequences for Finland. The Soviet Union initially wanted to trade territories with the Finns, as they wanted to protect St. Petersburg, or what was then called Leningrad. At the time, it was only 32 kilometers or 20 miles from Finland, way closer than it is today. The Finns controlled much of the Karelian Strip, placing them right at the gates of the Russian heartland. If an adversary wanted to hurt the Soviet Union, it would ally itself with Finland and attack from there. This adversary could very well be Germany. Although the Soviets initially allied themselves with the Germans in their attack on Poland, they didn't trust Hitler for one bit. He was very clear to the public that he hated the communists and wanted to destroy them. The negotiations for a land deal between the Soviet Union and Finland stalled, though, and for Stalin, this was enough reason to invade in 1939. It was the start of the infamous Winter War. The Soviets allegedly wanted to create a communist state in Finland, but it turned out to be a disaster for them. The Soviets attacked mostly near the Karelian Strip and the wider Karelia region, but they also attacked Lapland in the north. They had everything in their favor, including way more soldiers, tanks, and aircraft. The Soviets didn't make much progress, though, and it was far from the blitzkrieg they expected it to be. Temperatures were as low as negative 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was one of the coldest winters of the century. Also, the Finnish troops performed better than expected. The country didn't give up easily, as they wanted to protect their newly gained sovereignty at all costs. And obviously, the local Finnish troops were better prepared for the weather conditions. They knew how to stay warm, and their white camouflage helped them to virtually disappear in the snow. Finland's military strategists took advantage of the forests and the many lakes in the area, using them as natural barriers. The Soviets had to cross narrow paths where the Finns surrounded and ambushed them. Finland's commander-in-chief named Mannerheim was also very competent, as his Mannerheim line held the Soviets back for 2 months. The Finns also used small mobile units on jet skis for hit-and-run attacks as a type of guerrilla warfare. The Soviets were also frightened by Finland's infamous snipers. Simo Häyhä would go in the history books as the deadliest sniper to have ever lived. He is believed to have killed over 500 Soviet soldiers, and he survived the war despite being shot in the face. He wasn't the only soldier with multiple kills. The Soviets are estimated to have lost up to 170,000 soldiers, and 200,000 were wounded or sick. Compare that to Finland's 26,000 dead and 44,000 wounded. The casualty ratio was about 5-1, one of the most uneven losses in modern warfare. The same holds true for equipment. The Soviets lost anywhere from 1,200 to 3,500 tanks, while Finland only lost 20 to 30. The Soviets also lost about 250 to 500 aircraft. The Finns only 62. Despite these heavy losses, the Soviets were on the verge of a breakthrough in 1940. This forced Finland to the negotiating table, resulting in the Moscow Peace Treaty. Finland gave up Karelia, various islands, and some territories in the north. It wasn't over, though. For Finland, it was clear that it had to choose a side in World War II. Previously, it tried to join the Allies, but that wasn't possible anymore. The Nazis took over Denmark and Norway, so Finland was sandwiched in between the Nazis and the Soviets. That year, Soviets also took over the Baltic states, signaling that Finland could be next. The government in Finland preferred Germany over the Soviets, so they secretly allowed German troops to transit the country. Finland also started to buy arms from Germany. By June 1941, the inevitable war between the Soviets and the Nazis started with Hitler's Operation Barbarossa. It was the largest land offensive in human history, and Finland joined Germany's side. It once again declared war on the Soviet Union in what was later called the Continuation War. The idea was to regain Finland's former territories or even expand them according to the Greater Finland ideology. Together with the Germans, they recaptured all of the territories lost in the previous war and beyond. They successfully surrounded Leningrad and besieged it for 29 months. This came at the terrible human cost of 1.5 million Soviet lives. But despite the huge losses for the Soviet Union, the German invasion eventually failed. Finland suffered from this too. By September 1944, the Soviets regained all the territories Finland had initially won. Both parties signed the Moscow Armistice, and the 1940 Moscow Peace Treaty was restored. Finland needed to pay war reparations and expel the German soldiers still in Finland. Finland even briefly fought a war with Germany under Soviet pressure in order to drive the Germans out to Norway. After the end of World War II, Finland was once again in an interesting situation. It didn't want to become a Soviet vassal, but its relationship with Moscow was tense to say the least. Finland couldn't join the NATO alliance because the Soviets didn't allow them to. It would trigger a Soviet invasion, as Moscow wouldn't accept NATO being that close to the Russian Soviet. Finland also didn't take part in the Marshall Plan, unlike Western Europe, because it wanted to keep US influence out the door. The Finnish government even went as far as to censor anti-Soviet books and movies to please Moscow. This had to do with their agreement of friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance with the Soviet Union signed after World War II. But even with Finland's neutral stance in the Cold War and its efforts to please the Soviets, there was still a chance of an invasion. This could happen if a war between NATO and the Soviet Union broke out. Finland could be invaded because of its strategic position, regardless of its neutral status. To prevent this, Finland opted for a total defense system, just like its neighbor Sweden. Basically, this total defense concept means that the entire society could be mobilized for the potential purpose of war. Initially, Finland focused mostly on building up reserves through mandatory military service. The size of the country's armed forces was capped by the treaty with the Soviets, but not the size of the country's reserve forces. To this day, the massive number of reserves in Finland is one of the main things preventing an invasion. In the 1960s, Finland also started drawing up plans for its defense strategy, focusing mostly on the country's terrain as a natural barrier. This was inspired by the relatively successful Winter War of 1939. The military also set up territorial defense units that could fight independently of the central command. Civilians were prepared to survive during a war as they stocked up on supplies. The government also built bomb shelters all over the country to protect against an attack. In the capital Helsinki alone, they built 5,500 bomb shelters, some capable of withstanding a nuclear attack. Finally, Finland focused on having self-sufficient industries that couldn't be cut off during a conflict, including a military industry. Although this idea of total defense got less intense after the fall of the Soviet Union, it never fully disappeared. And after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Finland is once again laser-focused on self-defense. So, let's get into Finland's defensive capabilities, particularly against their historical enemy of Russia. With a population of only 5.6 million people, Finland seems to be very weak compared to Russia, which has 147 million people. Finland's $6.8 billion defense budget also bleaks in comparison to Russia's one. Recently, Putin approved a 13.5 trillion ruble defense budget, which is about $130 billion. But this doesn't directly translate into military power. As we have seen in Ukraine, having more resources doesn't guarantee success. This is especially true in Finland's case. If invaded, the country can quickly mobilize 280,000 trained soldiers. That's more than Putin's initial invading force into Ukraine. The reason why Finland has so many soldiers is simple. It still has universal male conscription. Men need to serve 6 to 12 months after they turn 18, and they have the time to do this until they're 29. That's also why Finland has 870,000 reserve personnel that can also be mobilized during a prolonged conflict. So the country of just 5.6 million people can fight with more than 1 million soldiers in total, which is very impressive. For Russia, that's a massive discouragement for not invading Finland. Its troops are already stretched thin in Ukraine, so fighting an additional army of 1 million soldiers is out of the question. And that doesn't even take into account the terrain in Finland. That's way harder to traverse than Ukraine. The country is filled with forests and lakes, which complicates any attempt to invade. Russia loves its mechanized brigades, but it's hard to move these units through the Finnish wilderness. There are tons of natural choke points in Finland, and the Finnish military has trained extensively on how to defend them. They have hundreds of defensive positions throughout the forests, from where they can harass the Russians and inflict serious damage on the enemy forces. This tactic has proven its worth in the Winter War, and the basic fundamentals haven't changed since. The worst thing for the Russians is that the Finns plan to retreat before they can catch enemy fire as part of some kind of guerrilla warfare tactic. This too has worked before in the Winter War. Guerrilla warfare makes an invasion a brutal operation, as the Russians are guaranteed to suffer way more losses than the Finns. Combine all of that with the fact that Finland is stacked with artillery. Finland has one of Europe's most impressive artillery arsenals, with 1,500 weapons. They have 700 howitzers, 700 mortars, and about 100 rocket launchers. For the Russian forces moving through the natural choke points, that's a nightmare. They're guaranteed to be pinned down by Finnish artillery and suffer major losses, on a scale much worse than in Ukraine. The troops in the defensive positions are also stacked with anti-tank weapons, like the N-Law from neighboring Sweden. This is a guided anti-tank missile that's very lightweight and launched from a soldier's shoulder. Finland has 3,000 of them, and it has ordered even more, seeing their success in Ukraine. This potentially brings the amount of N-Laws in Finland up to 10,000. The N-Law has allegedly been one of the best tank destroyers in Ukraine, only after the similar American Javelin. According to UK intelligence, Russia has lost more than 7,000 armored vehicles in Ukraine, including 2,500 tanks. The N-Laws took down 30 to 40% of these tanks, according to one analysis. Of course, the Kremlin can't afford a repeat of this in Finland, and the forested terrain in Finland makes it even easier to use N-Laws, because units can just hide behind the trees. Apart from the constant anti-tank missile threat, Russia's mechanized units will face competition in Finland. Finland has 200 Leopard 2 tanks, and these German beasts are widely regarded as some of the best tanks in the world. Finland also has about 200 infantry fighting vehicles, including the Swedish CV-90. Combined with a huge array of armored personnel carriers, Finland has quite an impressive mechanized army, especially considering its small size. It will likely use its armored fighting vehicles to protect strategic cities and key transportation hubs, because they're not as useful for the guerrilla tactics in the forested areas. Even when the Russians aren't in direct contact with the Finnish forces, they will never be safe. This has to do with Finland's multiple rocket launchers that can strike the Russian forces from a large distance. It has 35 Czech RM-70 launchers and 41 American M270 launchers, the latter with a maximum range of 90 miles or 150 kilometers. If these systems are spread across the country, they can cover all of Finland's territory. Because the Finnish military likely has an intelligence advantage in their home country, they probably know where the Russian convoys are. This gives them the ability to strike them from miles away. They could also hit the Russians far beyond the border and disrupt their supply lines and their troop reinforcements. Moving on to the air, Finland is also far from helpless. Recently, Finland ordered 64 F-35 fighter jets for a whopping $9.4 billion. They are going to replace Finland's 57 F-18 fighter jets that it bought back in 1995. Just to put that into perspective, that's $1,600 per Finnish citizen on fighter jets alone. Even though they're a small nation, they're clearly not playing around with defense. The F-35s are arguably the best fighter jets in the world, and they will be used to protect Finland's airspace from Russian jets and drones. Finland will spread their fighter jets across the country in times of crisis, ensuring that they can respond to Russian threats immediately. Interestingly, the F-35s also give Finland the capability to strike within Russian territory. The F-35s have incredible stealth capabilities, and they come with some of the best precision-guided munitions. This means that Finland will be able to crush Russian forward bases and convoys. Adding on to the Finnish Air Force is the country's growing drone inventory. It currently has 250 Israeli orbiter drones and 150 Chinese ones. But Finland is currently building a domestic drone manufacturing plant in cooperation with a Ukrainian company. They are going to supply Ukraine, Finland, and the rest of NATO with military drones. Mass production is planned to start in the first half of 2025. They're also looking into ground and sea drones, so Finland is really investing in the future of warfare. For air defenses, Finland recently hosted a few Patriot air defense systems coming from Germany. They can be transported to Finland in times of crisis. However, Finland's real plan is to buy Israeli David's Sling missile defenses. They have proven their worth multiple times in Israel, where they helped to defend against some large-scale Iranian missile attacks. If Finland were to get these air defenses, it would limit Russia's ability to strike them with cruise missiles and short-range ballistic missiles. Because Finland is also located at the Baltic Sea, we should also take a look at the country's navy. It has recently ordered 4 corvettes that are currently in construction domestically. They are a type of warship smaller than frigates, but that's ideal for a country like Finland. It only has to operate in the relatively shallow and small Baltic. Finland mostly focuses on the Gulf of Finland, because that's close to Russia and the only gateway from the Russian mainland into the Baltic. They also have a focus on coastal defense, because Finland's population mostly lives in the southern coastal area. They don't want Russian warships close to the coast, as they could hurt Finland's heartland. That's why Finland also has 5 mine layer and 8 missile launcher boats to block and attack Russian naval threats. On land, the Finnish coastal defense has an unknown amount of coastal guns and anti-ship missile launchers. In short, Finland's military capabilities are quite impressive. For a country of only 5 million people, it might seem strange how they can afford all this. And frankly, they can't really afford it. But the Finnish government is willing to cut expenditure on things like social services in order to pay for its military. It's also using national debt to pay for its military, with the government deficit rising to 4% of GDP in 2024. A big part of this is military expenditure. Defense spending has nearly doubled from the 2020 level, increasing to $6 billion a year in 2024. That's 2.4% of GDP, the 7th highest percentage in the NATO alliance. But there's public support for this, as people in Finland prioritize national defense above anything. Everyone in the country realizes how dangerous Russia can be, because it has had to deal with the nation in the past. This public awareness is also the reason why Finland has an army of more than 1 million potential fighters. Finland is one of the most patriotic countries in Europe, as 83% are willing to fight against a superior enemy, aka Russia. In the European Union, on average, only 32% of people are willing to fight in a war that involves their country. And importantly, a lot of these patriotic Finns could be armed in case of a conflict. The military has hundreds of thousands of assault rifles, and many of them are domestically produced. Civilians also have a lot of weapons, as Finland has 32 firearms per 100 citizens. This is the highest number in Europe apart from Serbia and Montenegro. Many Finns use them for hunting, but they'll be used to hunt down Russian soldiers if needed. This makes conquering and occupying Finland very hard for Russia. On top of that, Finland's population is more than prepared to live in a war, as they're gathering food, water, and medicine supplies. There's been more public awareness in Finland about this recently, but it isn't entirely new to them. Preparing for conflict has been the reality in Finland since the Cold War. Securing an independent energy supply is also vital, as temperatures can fall 20 degrees below the freezing point in the winter. The energy grid could face Russian attacks in the event of a war, just like in Ukraine. But the effects can be mitigated through backup generators that are present in a lot of households. They're also placed in all essential facilities like hospitals, water treatment plants, and telecommunication infrastructure. The country stores a lot of oil and LNG, allowing it to last for months without an external energy supply. It has an oil storage capacity of 63 million barrels and an LNG storage of 68,000 tons. So, it's clear that Finland will survive the first hours or days of the war on its own, just like Ukraine did. But we should also mention the elephant in the room. After a Russian invasion, Finland's allies will come to its defense. Finland is now a NATO member, and because of NATO Article 5, an attack against Finland will be considered an attack against all NATO allies. Its neighbors Norway and Sweden will immediately come to Finland's rescue, and in a matter of days, the Americans and other Europeans will also arrive with a huge fighting force. So, we should also mention what they can bring to the table. Norway, one of the founding members of NATO, has a very formidable military. It has 40 F-35s that could attack the Russians if they cross the Finnish border. Norway has also ordered more than 50 Leopard 2 tanks, doubling their existing inventory. The country can mobilize 70,000 military personnel in wartime, and some could be deployed to Finland in the case of a war. The most impressive part of its military is its navy, with 4 frigates and 6 corvettes. Although the Norwegian Navy can't help Finland directly, it can put pressure on Russia's military in the north. Sweden, on the other hand, excels with its own military-industrial complex. It has domestic defense manufacturers like Saab that supply its own military and others. This is perhaps because Sweden has the highest GDP and the most military spending in Scandinavia. A product of its domestic defense industry is the JAS-39 Gripen fighter jet. Sweden has almost 100 of them, and it recently ordered 60 more. They offer impressive capabilities at a moderate price point. Sweden also has 110 tanks, based on the German Leopard 2 but with a Swedish twist. Sweden's navy has 7 home-built corvettes that can help fight the Russians in the Baltic Sea. They can also transport Swedish troops and equipment over to Finland, which could be faster than the land corridor up north. Sweden can mobilize 64,000 military personnel that can be deployed in Finland. And unlike Norway, which has its own border with Russia to worry about, Sweden will likely go all in on defending Finland. By defending Finland, Sweden is also defending itself. Getting troops and equipment from other NATO members to Finland will be harder because it's a huge logistical operation. Logistics are often underestimated in war, but they're usually one of the determining factors in conflicts. Luckily, NATO already trained for this war scenario in multiple exercises, inducing the recent Nordic response exercise. This exercise is held every other year in Norway, but now it's expanded to Sweden and Finland. Apart from getting used to the terrain and cooperating between countries, they're training on how to get troops and equipment to the region. Last time, they transported 20,000 troops to the region, combined with more than 100 aircraft, 50 vessels including aircraft carriers, and tons of armored fighting vehicles. If Finland is actually invaded, the exact reaction of NATO is unknown. But undoubtedly, NATO already has a plan for this. It will involve the NATO Response Force, comprising units from all member countries that can be deployed on short notice. There are currently 500,000 troops in this response force, many of whom are already deployed in Eastern Europe. NATO is planning to deploy some to Finland as a preventive measure. In general, the NATO response force includes ground forces as well as naval and air units. During an invasion of Finland, air support would probably be the #1 priority for NATO. The alliance is capable of sending hundreds of fighter jets to Finland, including F-35s, Eurofighter Typhoons, and F-16s. NATO has over 3,000 fighter jets in total, and at least a fraction of them can be dispersed immediately. They could arrive in a matter of hours, although logistics are a limiting factor here. Russia also has a sizable air force, but it would probably lose access to Finland's airspace if NATO arrives. This means that Russian troops aren't safe anywhere in the country and could be attacked by air, which is a huge game changer. Secondly, NATO would send a lot of vessels to the Baltic Sea. Members in Northern Europe are able to send their ships in a matter of hours. The US Navy has some forward-positioned vessels in the UK, Italy, and Spain that could arrive in a few days. Vessels from the US East Coast could arrive in a week or two, potentially including aircraft carriers. Combined, the NATO fleet will help with controlling the Gulf of Finland and keeping Russian vessels from the Finnish coast. Last but not least, NATO would send a massive fighting force from the US and Europe, probably transported through Norway and Sweden. This is the hardest thing to do logistics-wise. The first rapid response units could arrive in a few days, but sending hundreds of thousands of troops will take weeks. It's not certain if NATO will take it this far because of the risk of further escalation with Russia. Because of Finland's own huge amount of conscripts, NATO ground forces are also not the most necessary component of support. And there's a possibility that the Russian invasion is halted before any major NATO ground force can arrive. After all, invading Finland will be significantly harder than invading Ukraine. This brings us right to the most important point of all. Because of Finland's relatively strong defenses, it's unlikely that Russia will ever invade. A reasonable Russian government would never see any value in starting a war up north, let alone starting a war with NATO. But with the current security environment, you never know. Both Finland and NATO are better off prepared than being caught in surprise. This is exactly why Finland joining NATO was considered such a big move. Finland offers NATO a lot of strategic value because of its position next to Russia and on the eastern flank of the alliance. The country has the unique ability to cripple one of Russia's Kola Peninsula in the Arctic Circle. It's one of the most militarized regions in the world because it hosts Russia's most strategic port in the city of Murmansk. This is the only Russian port in the Arctic that's accessible year-round due to the North Atlantic Current's warm water. Russia's northern fleet is located in the area, and a ton of Russia's nuclear submarines are based there. The northwestern piece of Russia also hosts a lot of nuclear ICBMs. However, this is all very close to Finland and Norway. In case of a war between NATO and Russia, they will immediately try to take down Russia's military facilities in the region. What gives Finland a unique advantage is that it's very close to the Murmansk corridor. Russia has two supply lines towards the Kola Peninsula, namely the R21 highway and the Kirov Railway. They pass through a choke point very close to the Finnish border, which is an ideal area to strike for NATO. The rest of the long road and railway is also within Finland's reach, making it very hard for Russia to defend. Without a supply route, the Kola Peninsula will have limited use in a long war. And if World War III starts, and let's just hope it doesn't, Finland will certainly be used in direct attacks on Russia. St. Petersburg is an obvious target for NATO because of its general economic importance, but also its military-industrial complex and its port. It could be attacked from both Finland and the Baltic states, as both are very close to the city. Finland sits just 93 miles or 150 kilometers from St. Petersburg, within the range of many missiles and drones. The other side of Finland's strategic importance has to do with defending the rest of the alliance. For one, Finland is able to block some of Russia's access to the Baltic. With Denmark and the control over the Danish Straits, NATO is already able to keep Russian warships from the Baltic Fleet out of the North Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. But now it's possible to block them at the Gulf of Finland, which has a width of only 40 miles or 70 kilometers at the narrowest point from Finland to Estonia. A blockade would keep the Russian vessels docked near St. Petersburg. It would also isolate the Kaliningrad exclave from the rest of Russia, with drastic consequences for the rest of the Baltic Fleet and other military forces stationed there. This blockade is not outside the realm of possibility now, NATO could use a combination of naval mines, advanced NATO vessels, anti-ship guns, and anti-ship missiles on both Finland's and Estonia's coasts. This would give the Russians a hard time passing through. And crucially, Finland could be used as a corridor to access the Baltic states. Just like Finland, they are very vulnerable as they're neighboring Russia. But Finland has Sweden and Norway right next to it, while the Baltics are very much surrounded by Russia. They're stuck in between Russia proper, Russia's vassal Belarus, and the Kaliningrad exclave. There's a small land border connecting Lithuania with Poland, called the Suwalki Gap, but it's only 40 miles or 65 kilometers wide. The Russian military from Kaliningrad could easily join forces with the Belarusian army and cut this connection off. This used to be a major bottleneck for NATO strategists. It would be hard to defend the NATO members of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were this to happen. And if NATO is vulnerable somewhere, it's something that Putin is bound to exploit. With Finland joining the alliance, though, it's now possible to resupply the Baltics from the north. Sweden also deserves credit, as it has a very strategic position in the area just like Finland. It sits right west of the Baltics, and it has a huge coastline along the Baltic Sea. Sweden's strategic island of Gotland could be used to dominate the Baltics. If NATO builds a permanent air base and seaport there, it will be able to fight Russian vessels in the area. It's often called an unsinkable aircraft carrier, providing swift access to the whole region. And when NATO establishes control over the Baltic Sea, Russia has no business attacking the Baltic states. Turning back to Finland, there's one final contribution it brings to the alliance, and that's inspiration. Interestingly, the newest member is arguably one of the most prepared ones of them all. There are reports that countries like Germany and the UK would fall in days if faced with a full-scale attack. They don't have the supplies and the sheer quantity of equipment and troops to last in a major war. This is because they've been lulled into a sense of security, as they didn't face major threats for decades and were always safeguarded by America. Finland has never had that same luxury, and the other NATO members are taking notes from the country. To sum it all up, Finland is prepared for war with Russia. Driven by the historical tension and the modern-day proxy war in Ukraine, it's building up its military and preparing its citizens for the worst. Let's just hope that Russia never invades and that a war between NATO and Russia doesn't become a reality.